Diversity. You have caused confusion.
Fascist moron.
Now, hello everybody. If my calculations are correct, you should be watching this on Halloween. And yesterday you'll have been softened up by my definitive guide to Hammer horror, which hopefully made you curious about the films themselves and, of course, whether they're any good. And I deliberately held back from discussing the films too much in that video because I knew that today I'd be inviting a special guest. If only I knew somebody who ran a horror film channel here on YouTube. And turns out I do. A certain Proper Horror Show, who will be dropping in a moment to give us her 10 essential Hammer horrors. And then, after that, I shall provide my own top 10 list. Now, before we get going, I think it's worth mentioning, I didn't really talk about this in the last video, but it's worth mentioning in the context of a top 10 list like this. Hammer always had a lot of problems with the critics. All of its famous films were panned. Curse of Frankenstein, when it came out, was panned by the critics. Dracula was panned by the critics. In their own time, these films were not respected by film buffs, by cinema critics, but they were loved by audiences who flocked to see them. They were always good at the box office, popular with fans, but really not very popular with the tastemakers. And this actually became something that the studio was quite defiant about. In many interviews, for example, Peter Cushing said, well, the thing is, as an actor, I choose parts that people actually want to see me play in. You know, I could do Hamlet and things like that, but what do people want to see Peter Cushing in? And they want to see Frankenstein. So he kept on doing Frankenstein films. So in his view, he was there to please the audience and not to please himself. This is the Colonel, Sir James Carreras, and he said, "Keep it up, we certainly shall, not with arty, crafty pictures to please an egg-headed minority, but, as always, with a steady flow of highly exploitable box office properties designed to attract and please the masses, upon whose support depends the prosperity of our entire industry." But I think this defiant attitude of Carreras at the time, his happiness to exploit sexual thrills and things like that, and the general perception that Hammer's trademark was really in three things: colour, blood, and sex, those three elements. And I think because of that, and perhaps because these were mid-budget films, some of them were low-budget films, made reasonably quickly. I mean, they churned them out in 6-7 weeks, short production cycles. And for all these reasons, I think that the actual work itself is sold a little bit short, or has been historically sold a little bit short on the critical front, and is not thought of as art in the same way that, say, a Stanley Kubrick film would be thought of as art. I think that there's a tendency to think of Hammer films as product, as opposed to the work of genuine professionals, craftsmen, artists, and so on and so forth. And I think this is a little bit unfair to the people who worked on them. It's unfair to Terence Fisher, the director, unfair to the set guy, Bernard Robinson, who worked on many of them. It's unfair to James Bernard and all of the other, Anthony Hines, and all of the other people I talked about yesterday, who are actually very good at their jobs. And considering what they were working with, I think left us a body of work that produces a kind of fantasy film universe, and not just the gothic period fantasy stuff that they're famous for, but also some of their contemporary English settings. There's something beautifully English and charming about so many of these films, as Proper Horror Show is about to talk about with some of her picks coming up. So, with all of that said, I've talked enough. Let Proper Horror Show take it away.
So you fancied indulging in some homemade British flagship entertainment, but for whatever reason, Peaky Blinders just isn't cutting it.
This company is a modern enterprise and believes in equal rights for women. And if it does, mate.
Great stuff. Well, you could do a lot worse than looking into Hammer Films and Hammer Horror, but as you will know from AA's video yesterday, there is an awful lot to choose from, so where do you start? At AA's request, I've put together this list of 10 essential films. This isn't so much a best-of guide, it's not a top 10. It's more of a list of films that I think will give you a good understanding of Hammer, if that's what you're really interested in. Naturally, there's a lot of subjectivity in there, and I think what you're seeing will be still, to an extent, the best of what they did. But I'm also giving you a full picture. And I've brought in my own sort of characterisation in here. I believe that there are very much eras of Hammer horror, as AA believes. I do it slightly differently, and you will see that as we go on. But I also think that what you get from Hammer is extremely influenced by whether it was an A-team production, sort of all the biggest stars, all the most important people, the most experienced tight-knit group, or whether it was a bit more off the leash, a bit more experimental, one of the B-team productions, especially as you get later in the day, under the stewardship of Michael Carreras. So I will bring that angle in. What counts as A-team and B-team gets a little bit muckier later on, but we'll go into it anyway. I'll waste no more time and move straight on to number 10. Now I can imagine a fair few people are saying, "What? How can you do this? It's outrageous. It's unfair. Dracula at number 10? I have my reasons for this. Now, it definitely makes this essential list. It's A-team, it's that early Glory Days style, and there is an awful lot to recommend it. Certainly it's incredibly pacey. It's very stylish, and Peter Cushing is doing an absolutely great job this time in the hero role, in contrast to The Curse of Frankenstein, the previous production. And I'm certainly a massive fan of how they really foregrounded the sexuality of Dracula in some quite interesting ways that were certainly pushing the bar at the time. But at the same time, I'm not going to have it much higher on the list because it is very much a straight story with not much else going on there. Certainly some lovely character actors who make welcome appearances, but also there's some stodginess in the way it's delivered, and the direction isn't as strong as it would be later, even from the same team. So for that reason, well, in addition to Christopher Lee being somewhat underused in Dracula, he stopped speaking after 10 minutes. For all those reasons, I think it is essential, but it's not going to go much higher up the list than this. Now for number 9, I've gone for a much later production that you could arguably say is a fair bit shakier than Dracula, but is also, I would say, a lot more interesting. This is the A-team of the time, as I would call it. It's very much of one of their last hurrah features, where they were trying some very different stuff and just seeing what might work. And in this case, it's the very simple idea of doing Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, but in this time, Dr. Jekyll turns into a woman. Yes, stop sniggering at the back. Now, in addition to shaking up the standard and very well-known Jekyll and Hyde story by having Ralph Bates' Dr. Jekyll turn into a very stunning Martine Beswick, they've also shaken it up by adding in the Jack the Ripper element. They have Burke and Hare thrown in rather anachronistically, but it does add to the fun. And it's also very interesting after you've seen quite a few Hammers to see them do something in the London setting. So it just sort of shakes it up and makes it a bit more interesting and gets you the idea of some of that variety you have in Hammer. Dr. Jekyll and Sister Hyde, it is funny, it is savage, it's also sexy, but I would say it doesn't become smutty in the way that some of the films from the same year and beyond would be. Martine Beswick is absolutely superb in this. She is worth watching. The film is worth watching for her alone. Additionally, there is a much celebrated effect in the transformation sequence, the first time that Jekyll turns into Sister Hyde, and that is a lot of fun, and the humour is very good as well. However, I do have to say it's a little shaky on the plot, it's a little shaky on the world building, it kind of meanders a tad. For instance, you're never exactly sure why Dr. Jekyll needs to be offing prostitutes. It doesn't quite come together. And it doesn't fully make use of the premise. There's a sort of awkward tendency in Hammer that the second of the 2 times I've seen it, whenever you've had a male character turn into a woman, they instantly seek to get raddled by a succession of gents, and it's just a little odd. I mean, maybe that needs a little analysis. Anyway, I think that's very much worth seeing, a very interesting film. Now, a really unusual one at number 8 is Bette Davis's The Nanny. This is an A-team production, I would say, but it's definitely an experimental one. This is somewhere between a horror and a thriller, and it is wonderfully tense. There is a question throughout when things are going wrong in relation to a family being rather torn apart. Is it the nanny at fault, or is it their very errant child? You know, which one's the wrong one? And the film holds that tension rather wonderfully. And in addition to that, it gives you something else that is wonderful to see in Hammer, which is the slice of life aspect. This film will show you, unselfconsciously, London in the mid-60s. And it's just fascinating to see it, really. Just unfiltered. It wasn't intending to have this sort of documentary effect, but it gives you that, and it's just really interesting what they show you about life as it was without intending to do so. Now, there's an absolutely fantastic performance from Bette Davis, just holding the whole thing, and the psychology that's going on there in the drama is wonderful. As for weaknesses, it may be a little bit slow in parts. You do have issues of child actors, and I wouldn't say that any of the other actors are particularly astounding in this. It really is a Bette Davis driven show, and so that keeps it down for that reason. But otherwise, there are no huge flaws that stood out to me. You're not going to see this on many lists, but I would really recommend seeking this one out. It is one of the more unusual Hammers, but it is really worth your time.
He's just dropped a bloody flower box on my head, damn near killed me.
But he didn't, and you're trespassing.
What are you, some kind of nut?
Now, in contrast, at number 7, this absolutely had to be here. This is a 18 production, early glory, The Curse of Frankenstein, the film that really kicked off the Hammer horror. Obviously, Quatermass came before, but this is the one that really kicked off the phenomenon and gave the team its direction for a couple of years to go. Now, this is much higher up than Dracula, even though it also has a somewhat weak direction from Terence Fisher, who is still learning how to direct horror and would really improve his craft as he went on. But this has much better humour in it, I would say, some wry humour that I particularly appreciate from Jimmy Sangster, wonderfully delivered by Peter Cushing. And Christopher Lee gets even less to do than in Dracula, but he's still able to bring in a whole lot of pathos into his performance in some later scenes. But the star of the show is Peter Cushing, and what really works for me in this Frankenstein, more than any other film's Frankenstein, is that this film is absolutely unequivocal about what an absolute bastard Frankenstein is. His moral turpitude is never in doubt in a way that it's not the centrepiece of, say, the Colin Clive performance from the James Whale Frankenstein, or certainly not the misunderstood, tortured homoerotic genius of Kenneth Branagh. Kenneth Branagh does like playing geniuses, doesn't he? It's weird how that happens. Anyway, this film is absolutely clear. Frankenstein is morally bankrupt, and that just informs the film and gives it a stunning worldview. So for that reason, it's one of my favourite Frankensteins and had to be in this list. When I was putting this list together, I was very much reminded of some terms that Mr. D introduced me to, a grower versus a shower. Now, The Nanny is definitely a grower. It grows on you over time. It won't sort of blow you away, but you'll be very impressed with it, and you'll sort of wander back to it and appreciate it more with time. Whereas the Curse of Frankenstein is absolutely bombastic, so it's a shower. It's instantly impressive. Now in the case of The Mummy, which I put at number 6, it's another shower. This is almost the exact same team as The Curse of Frankenstein and Dracula. That's Jimmy Sangster writing, Terence Fisher directing, and Cushing and Lee in the hero and villain roles respectively. And in this time, what puts it above The Curse of Frankenstein is just a little more confidence in the direction, a slightly more sort of impactful action, that because blood isn't being shed as much, they're able to show a bit more impact, which I think helps land the action scenes a bit more. It feels like more confident direction from Terence Fisher, having now done 3 of them in very short succession. It's also getting into sort of more interesting worldview, more interesting discussions, and a kind of unapologetic British Empire backing, which you just absolutely would not see today. It's delightful for that. As a weakness, well, it's not much of a weakness. I'm sort of nitpicking at this point because I really like this film, but if I had to pick something, I would say that these early ones do tend to really lean on a sort of broad humour, of borderline carry-on humour in some isolated segments, and that's very much the case with The Mummy. I don't care for it myself. But nevertheless, The Mummy is fantastic and definitely worth watching. Now for the next film on the list that I think is essential Hammer viewing, I've gone for Twins of Evil, and in doing so I'm probably inviting some derision. This film is not particularly well thought of, and it doesn't exactly invite itself to be respected. It looks and portrays itself as, well, what it is, latter-day exploitation, which nevertheless is a very significant part of Hammer. It's the final part in what they call the Karnstein cycle, the Karnstein trilogy, and most people, when they think of this time of Hammer where they were being more overtly sexual and able to show full nudity, most people, when they go for this period, they think of the first entry, The Vampire Lovers with Ingrid Pitt. But I'm going to say I don't actually go for that film very much. I don't like it very much. And so I went for Twins of Evil. And there are at least 4 good reasons to prefer Twins of Evil to The Vampire Lovers.
Of course. You'd like us to look our best. Oh, no.
Number 1, the Collinson twins are delightful.
Tuff is bound to find out soon. I can't keep covering up for you.
They're a sort of interesting dynamic, interesting protagonists. They shake it up, they're a bit new, and you may not have expected the best performances from Playboy models, but I think they do a very good job, and they're certainly carried very well by the rest of the cast. The villain of the piece is an absolute delight. He's fabulous. He's got that sort of gleeful Palpatine energy that is a bit of a joy to watch. He's evil and he absolutely loves it.
You are charlatans, all of you. Get out!
And Twins of Evil was certainly not chaste and would not be approved by Mary Whitehouse, is less overtly smutty and softcore than The Vampire Lovers, which I did feel went quite far over the line, and that sort of ruined it for me. But the number 1 reason that I would say Twins of Evil should be on this list, and is on this list a lot higher up than I think anyone would probably say could be justified, is that the worldview in Twins of Evil is quite complicated. It's not black and white. You have witch hunters, Puritan witch hunters led by Peter Cushing, who are burning women, and you might think they are the primary villain, but they are in a world where there absolutely are vampires, there are witches, there are demons. So that already shakes it up. But what makes it even better is that when they discover that the local elite are utterly corrupt and evil, the realpolitik kicks in, and he just gleefully points out that they can't take him down. He has political backing. And that is a really interesting dynamic to see in Hammer horror, where typically the villain and hero are very distinct, and it's very obvious how they're going to resolve things.
Let him shoot, Joachim. The Emperor will hang them all.
This just makes it that little more complex, and that's what I really appreciated about it. At the same time, to be fair and balance things out, there are some problems with the production in that it does look a bit cheap. One thing that comes to mind is that all the witch burnings were very clearly shot in one go, with the same setup just interspersed throughout the films, and it does bother me a bit, so there we go. Now, I know that most audiences won't think that Twins of Evil is a full masterpiece, of course, but I think there's enough good in there that most of the audience will be at half-mast a piece if they watch the whole thing. Moving on to number 4, I have gone for 1958's The Revenge of Frankenstein. Now, in pretty much any list like this, you are going to see some sequels because that was a major part of Hammer, especially from the mid-60s onwards. The American producers just insisted they keep cranking out Dracula and Frankenstein movies, no matter how sick Christopher Lee got of them. But when you see a list like this, you're almost inevitably going to see a different film. It's going to be Frankenstein Created Woman. And there's a fair amount to like in that film, certainly, but I am not putting it on this list for a couple of reasons. The set design looks notably cheap. They use the same 4 locations over and over so many times that it becomes almost silly. I mean, this is something that happened throughout Hammer, but it's just so obvious. Anyone riding outside comes across the same gallows. I mean, why? It bugs me. And additionally, the main villains of the piece, these cartoonish toffs, including a very young Derek Folds, are just absolutely, they're caricatures and too over the top. It's pantomime. It kind of ruins it for me. So for that reason, I step over that. I also wouldn't go for Frankenstein Must Be Destroyed in this list, even though I liked it more. And that's just because I felt the plot lacked a strong drive, and there was also a very unpleasant, unnecessary forced intimacy scene, again requested by the American producers. I wonder who that was. I should look that up. Maybe on Wikipedia. And so I have gone for The Revenge of Frankenstein, which I feel is very looked over. It's the first sequel to The Curse of Frankenstein. You could pretty much just call this early days glory as well as franchising. But there is so much here to love. For a start, the opening is nice and strong, carrying on directly from the first film, and that is something almost unique in the sequels. Most of the sequels have almost nothing to do with each other. If you watch a couple of these, you'll see that the matter of whether Frankenstein needs to be in hiding or not is basically forgotten. Whereas here, the direct continuity is nice and I appreciate it. It feels like it is the same characters going on. It also has an incredibly dark worldview. It uses a Frankenstein setting to tell you a story that is just incredibly bleak and blackpilling about human nature, with a character who sort of thinks Frankenstein can help him but ultimately realises that he is the problem. I'm afraid this is a nature thing, not a nurture thing. It's very well told. I don't want to spoil it, but I think you'd appreciate it. And as another thing, just a kind of random element that really didn't need to be in here at all. Another thing that raises The Revenge of Frankenstein up for me is that the writer included, for reasons I can only speculate about, an anti-union B story.
Well, the fact remains, gentlemen, Dr. Stein must be made to join this council, or steps must be taken to see that he is no longer permitted to practice in this city.
It's entirely inessential to the plot, but I enjoyed it. What can I say? I think you'd probably enjoy it too. It adds a nice bit of flavour to the film that really raises The Revenge of Frankenstein up for me. And that is why The Revenge of Frankenstein had to be at number 4. Now, inevitably in a list like this, you are going to see The Plague of the Zombies, but that is because it is simply that good. There's no point arguing it. It's a wonderful little picture. It's from more of a B-team unit. It's very experimental, but it's also feels like a distilled product. It's something where they really know what they're doing and have got you a kind of streamlined Hammer horror with excellent characterization. I'm thinking particularly the first scene with the father and daughter establishing their dynamic is a bit of a delight. And just everyone on it seems to inhabit their role extremely well. It also speaks to the sort of consistent element of populism in Hammer horror. I guess if I'm trying to get you an idea of what Hammer is and what they did, then I have to include something about the populism. In this case, you do have a corrupt elite, and you often in Hammer have a corrupted elite as the villains, but the heroes also tend to be elites. So you have a good elite trying to correct an evil, corrupted elite. And this, I believe, was largely a very conscious design to appeal to the working class cinema audience who would like that message and would enjoy seeing the toffs taken down a bit. Now, that happened in Frankenstein Created Woman, very obviously, but in that case it was absolute over the top and cartoonish and just came off silly, whereas here it's a little more restrained, it's more sinister, and I like that a lot more. Now, this was cut down a fair bit by the BBFC, but I don't think you really come to Hammer for a huge amount of gore, so it doesn't affect it too much, it's still powerful. And for Blake Sevens fans, you get to see a lovely young Jacqueline Pierce, who was fantastic, and she was also in The Reptile, which Hammer sneakily shot back to back with this. Anyway, yes, Plague of the Zombies, very unusual in the way it delivers its horror for Hammer, but it is creative, it's got an excellent cast who just do their jobs very well, and including a nice elevated role for Hammer regular Michael Ripper, who is usually an innkeeper, and in this case he gets to have a lot more to do. So Plague of the Zombies, fantastic. You know, it also does something else that I really appreciate from Hammer. When they have resolved the plot and they've defeated the villain, the film pretty much ends instantly, and they almost all do this. You don't tend to have like 5 minutes of denouement where people talk about their feelings. No, the film just ends very quickly. They won't even fade to black. They'll just... I'm thinking of Curse of Frankenstein and them just playing the credits over the gallows, that sort of thing. Anyway, Plague of the Zombies, an absolute must-watch, and hence being at number 3. Now going on to 2, the penultimate one. You probably won't be too surprised to see this, The Devil Rides Out. This is an A-Team production, it is a last hurrah, and it's something that they didn't really want to produce for a number of reasons. One of which was that the BBFC head at the time, John Trevelyan, was rather hesitant and restrictive on any occult matter, in contrast to him being extremely liberal on pretty much everything else. But this was a passion project for Christopher Lee, who had been very loyal to the company, and I think that probably persuaded them to let him be the driving force behind this. And it produced an unusually straight-faced, extremely sincere film that really helped sell an unusual type of horror for Hammer, that is, the occult horror. And there are big problems with The Devil Rides Out. There is a very blatant Deus Ex Machina ending. A lot of the effects do not hold up nowadays, but at the same time it manages to deliver genuine tense scares during one of its most famous scenes, which I've got pictured up there for you. It also has a very nice performance from Paul Eddington, which the second unexpected Yes Minister cast member turning up in this. But despite the weaknesses, it really is Christopher Lee delivering an absolute standout performance. All of this is helped by an incredibly tightly paced script from Richard Matheson. There is barely a minute wasted in this film. So it's an absolute delight. Really one of the best they ever did, and I wish they had done a bit more in this, but it was done towards the end of Hammer's reign, alas. So even though it's extremely well regarded today, it's a bit unique among Hammer. And that brings us to my top choice, which is The Witches, from 1966, a B-Team production, an experimental production, and an absolute delight. I don't expect this to be number 1 on most lists. I don't expect this to be in the top 10 on most people's lists, but that's because it's quite overlooked and rather hard to find. It's certainly not as easy to get your hands on as the Dracula or Frankenstein films, and even more creative ways of acquiring films online will often not work for this film. I managed to rent a copy through BFI Player, and so I would recommend that to you. But anyway, why is this number 1?
Well, there are hardly any girls parts because hardly any girls invented anything.
Well, it's an amazing atmospheric film about a former missionary teacher stationed in an unspecified African country who has a traumatic experience with witch doctors there. You never get full details on that, and I think it's one of those cases where leaving it to the imagination and seeing the impact on her really does make it ever more impactful and horrific for us, the audience. But she comes back to take up a teaching role in a quaint English village, and things are not what they seem. This is an absolutely gorgeous, authentic bit of English village life. And just like The Nanny, it has that amazing quality that you can get in Hammer, where it was never the intention of the film, but you just get to see a bit of England as she was. You get to see a beautiful English village for 84 minutes and just enjoy it. It's absolutely beautiful, seeing it unsullied by modernity. Now, in addition to that unintended bonus aspect of this as a historical artifact, it's also a very competent horror film. I might lose a fair few of you here because it requires a bit of buy-in and it's delivered in a very sincere way that might not work for people. I would say if you like the 2018 Suspiria remake, it will probably work for you. And if not, it might strike you as a bit goofy, basically. It might lose you in the finale. But if you can stick with it, you get a wonderful tale of building suspicion and paranoia and tension as some fairly horrible things start to happen. There is a really interesting scene that's in the village butcher that's just very, very sinister. And I think probably the reason this has a 12 certificate. But the main draw is the finale, where there's some very, very unsettling goings on. Also very an interesting use of a kind of bit of homoeroticism as a sign of a sign of evil influence. They're quite unusual for Hammer. They were certainly more happy to indulge in that when it was Ingrid Pitt and Madeline Smith in The Vampire Lovers. In this one, it's, well, I'll let you explore it for yourselves. Joan Fontaine carries the whole film, but I wouldn't say there are any weak members of the cast at all. And overall, it's just charming, which is maybe one of the things that people do go to Hammer for.
Afternoon, miss.
Good afternoon.
I'm Dowsett. I look after your garden for you.
It's lovely.
I'm not going to say that they're going to be the scariest films, but I would say that aspect of them being charming is extremely notable, and this absolutely wins on that front. I do think it delivers some genuine, slightly unsettling horror in the finale, and it absolutely delivers on charm. Now, to be fair and address the weaknesses, I would say the pacing gets a tiny bit sloppy after the second act, after the midpoint, but it is a very brief section in a very brief film. It feels weird and churlish to complain about the pace lagging in a film that is 84 minutes long. So it's a very weak criticism. As I said, not many people are going to see The Witches, but it's a shame. I would say it is absolutely essential Hammer, and I would much rather that people, when they thought of Hammer horror, set their minds on The Witches rather than Dracula AD's 1972, for example. Alright, I will leave it there. That was my essential Hammer horror films. Thank you very much, AA, for giving me the chance to talk about my specialist subject. And if you do decide to check out Hammer horror, good on you.
Well, some very interesting choices and comments from Proper Horror Show there. I definitely agree with many of the things that she said, including that I appreciate the fact, as Proper Horror Show does, that Hammer films just tend to end. There's no lingering, monster's dead, credits. It's a refreshing sense of lack of sentimentality, if you want. No messing around, no emotional kind of wrapping up or anything. Credits. So that was a good observation from Proper Horror Show, among many others, The English Charm, and some of those choices are very interesting too. Now, my list, I have to admit, is a little bit more mainstream, and I'll explain my thinking as I go through. That said, my 10th pick is a little bit outside of the usual picks. It's The Gorgon, directed by Terence Fisher in 1964. And I've picked this because it is very gothic. It's one of the most gothic feeling of all of the Hammer pictures. It's got Christopher Lee, it's got Peter Cushing, it's got this rather slow and methodical pace that Fisher favours. Fisher said, and I quote, "I am unashamedly and totally without modesty very proud of The Gorgon. It is a film that emphasises the poetics of the fantastic rather than the horror. I am very pleased with the characters in that film. They're a lot more complex than is usually the case, and there's more mystery lurking around them too, which can be very rare in this type of film. There are far too often only the spectacle counts rather than the psychological motivation leading up to that event. The script was written by John Gilling and is one of the best scripts I ever worked on." So that is Fisher's estimation of The Gorgon. Now, I will admit it is definitely one of the slower Hammer films, but it has atmosphere in spades, and I kind of love the sets in this one, where first of all you have this dilapidated mansion, this gothic, epic kind of space full of cobwebs and moonlight for the characters to roam around in, but also the Peter Cushing character here he's kind of a heel in this one. He's a baddie, plays this doctor who is not the most ethical doctor, shades of Frankenstein, to be honest, but on the walls there he's got these medical drawings, these 19th century medical diagrams and things, and I don't know, it's really good. Christopher Lee plays a good guy against type in this, and he's pretty hammy as the professor in this one. James Carreras was famously quoted, "Oh, it just looks like Christopher Lee in a wig." I would say it's not one of Lee's best roles here, and the special effects of The Gorgon, can be sniggered at, I suppose, but I think it makes up for all of that. It's kind of melodramatic, but this is the gothic fantastique, I guess, that Fisher was going for. So my next pick is Frankenstein Created Woman. Again, another Terence Fisher. Now, obviously Hammer were famous for its two big series, arguably three if you include The Mummy. Frankenstein, Dracula are its two big ones. And if you ask me, Frankenstein is the more interesting series in a way, and is probably the better series. Partly that's because Terence Fisher, I think there were 6-7 Frankenstein movies, and he directs 6 of them. He only doesn't do The Horror of Frankenstein and The Evil of Frankenstein. So he does. So there are 8, and he does 6 of them. And Frankenstein Created Woman is interesting because it has this odd soul transfer mechanism that goes on, where the woman that you see here has the soul of her boyfriend transferred into her. So there's an odd gender swapping element involved, and there are these horrible Hooray Henrys, these toffs. You can see one of them on the screen there, who just bully the hell out of this guy, and the woman that you can see. For some reason, the soul transfer turns her hair from brunette to blonde using impeccable Hammer logic there. And there's all sorts of interesting questions. Now Peter Cushing as Frankenstein in this one is a little bit more subdued, and he's a little bit, dare I say, less evil in this one. He's more of almost a kind of background character as this revenge plot plays out of the kind of young couple versus the horrible Hooray Henrys. But I find it quite enjoyable. Definitely one of the more enjoyable Frankenstein films. And I mean, I will admit I don't like the sets as much in this one. I think you can tell that the film suffers from having moved from Bray Studios at this point. But I'm willing to forgive that because it's definitely one of the more interesting movies in general. It's playing around with moral, ethical ideas, and Frankenstein, the Baron here, is forced to almost come face to face with the moral problems of what he's actually doing. And there's a glimmer, there's a moment where he realizes that he's driven this girl to suicide not once, but twice. You'd think this may humanize him, but as we'll see, that doesn't happen. Next pick from me is The Mummy, another Terence Fisher from 1959. Now, Proper Horror Show picked this one as well, and I just love it. It, for a start, this has to be the most gorgeous looking of all of the Hammer movies, especially if you get it in the recent HD or Blu-ray versions. The version I watched was on Amazon Prime, and it just looked fantastic in high definition, and has Jack Asher with his romantic, beautiful cinematography. It's got this central set piece where you get a flashback to the Christopher Lee character, the Mummy, thousands of years ago, and it's all done in this very almost stilted manner, but it works given the Egyptian setting and what they actually got an Egyptologist to advise them on the particulars of what was going on. Another thing that you have here is this West versus East, colonial British Empire versus the traditionalist Egyptian storyline going on. I played a clip of it in the last video, and I love how that plays out as well, and how unapologetic Cushing is, and in a way how unapologetic the film is about all of that, and yet it still registers the a kind of pang of moral questioning, or dare I say even guilt about it all. So yeah, it's a very interesting film from that point of view as well. I'm sure post-colonial scholars could have a field day with some of those scenes too. George Pastel is good as the as the ethnic villain here, and I have to say that Christopher Lee is fantastic as the Mummy. Hammer actually returned to the Mummy 3 more times, always as a support feature, but I think they knocked it out of the park from the get-go with this one. This is the strongest of the Mummy movies, arguably the strongest of any of the Mummy movies. That is, if you include the old Universal ones and the modern abominations with the Rock in them, etc. I would argue this is the best, the definitive Mummy movie by anybody. And Christopher Lee's character has a humanity and sadness about him, and you really are made to think, my God, he's been there, stuck in that casket for 2,000 years, and yet he's still human, he's still real, he still has a consciousness about him. So that is haunting, and given that you can only see Lee's eyes, it's a fantastic performance. Cushing is great in this one too, Pastel is good, and Fisher, as Proper Horror said, is pretty confident. There's almost a swagger about the way he directs this one. I'm sticking with Terence Fisher and the main franchises here for my 7th pick, my number 7 pick, which is Dracula, Prince of Darkness. This was the first time Lee came back to the role of Dracula after playing him in 1958, so in absence of 6 years. And really, if you were to ask what is the quintessential Hammer horror feel to a film, and it's this. I mean, it was one of the final films made at Bray. You have these 4 young people turning up in the middle of nowhere, somewhere in Middle or Eastern Europe, probably a hamlet in Germany or something. They turn up to the big mansion. Clove is on hand. And, I mean, I think the film goes something like 45 minutes before Dracula even puts in an appearance. So there's a lot of scene setting. Fisher always takes his time. He builds up that suspense. This scene that you can see here, where Clove actually conducts almost this ritualistic sacrifice, where they slits the throat and the blood, Kensington blood, gallons of it, drips down, oozes down into this tomb. Dracula then reborn for the first time is absolutely fantastic. And I don't know if there's something very archetypically Hammer about Dracula Prince of Darkness. I feel like this one was shown on TV quite a bit, so I've got some fun kind of nostalgia for it as well. But yeah, definitely. I mean, Christopher Lee doesn't talk in it; he just kind of hisses. But the other side of his portrayal of Dracula is that he's very. I mean, he flips from being this urbane gentleman to this animalistic beast. He's got a beast-like feeding frenzy, and that part of his performance, I think, is, I mean, I hesitate to say underrated because it's Christopher Lee as Dracula, but given how much he moaned about his own portrayal of his own appearances in these movies, I think it's easy to forget how good he is as Dracula, both as the urbane gent, but also as the horrific monster that he turns into when he gets the feeding frenzy, And it's all in this movie. The seduction of the women, which I'll talk about in some of my later picks, is an ongoing theme here. And this cements many of the tropes. There was a second, this is actually the third Dracula movie. There was a second one called Brides of Dracula that doesn't have Lee in it. That's a pretty good movie too. But it just missed out on my top 10. Number 6 is the first of the picks, or the second of the picks that make both my list and Proper Horror Show's list. That is The Plague of the Zombies. Actually, a B movie. It was the support feature to Dracula Prince of Darkness, so you can imagine going to see that as a double bill. You'd see this movie and then you'd see Prince of Darkness back to back. One of the last films at Bray, and this is a knockout. I mean, it's got some pretty dark and horrific scenes. These zombies are made into slaves down this mine, and they're being whipped, with a complete lack of remorse by this incredibly imperious villain character played by John Carson, and Henri Morel is a very solid lead in this film. Got a great ensemble cast, as Proper Horror Show said. Michael Ripper's given more to do than usual, and just a great feel to this film. Nor an ounce of fat on it. I think Gilling it was a pacier director than Fisher, so there's less of that kind of foreboding build-up of suspense and more of, it just kind of goes for it, this one. So Plague of Zombies, brilliant film. Number 5 is the original Dracula from 1958, Mr. Harker. I love that initial scene of Lee as Dracula. This, again, I think is quintessentially Hammer. You can see the Bernard Robinson design, the twirling pillars, the twisted pillars that he loved to put in. I love the scenes where Van Helsing is, he turns up at the tavern and you get to see out in the village and so on. The amount of time, I guess, it takes before you see like the real Dracula where he bares his fangs, the seduction of the women. There's an interesting sexuality to the way that Dracula's bite is obviously a stand-in for some sort of consummation of the sex act. And there's a young couple in this film. It's Michael Gough and Melissa Stribling. And Stribling, you can tell, is kind of dissatisfied with her husband. And then Dracula shows up, and she is obviously getting something from the whole process of the seduction and being bitten. Kind of a interestingly low-key kind of sexual performance from Stribling. And this is an enduring theme in these Dracula films, that he is Dracula as the Prince of Darkness. He corrupts these women. He turns them to the dark side. And this corruption, you could argue, is a metaphor. It's a metaphor in these films for the pervasive and the increasing liberalisation of society. Now, this film was made in 1958 when this was just happening. But as the Dracula films go on, I think you can see Dracula himself as a metaphor for society writ large, and especially for how society writ large is trying to awaken the sexuality of women with, liberalisation and the consequences of that seduction. Those themes are all there in the original Dracula, but as we'll see in some of the later films, it is developed upon, and I will return to that in a second. Now, arguably, The Curse of Frankenstein, the one that started it all, is a stronger film than Dracula. Dracula, I'll just say, does have a phenomenal end sequence. The last 10 minutes or so, the fight between Van Helsing and Dracula, Cushing and Lee, is absolutely fantastic. And the death of Dracula, especially in the restored Blu-ray version, is just phenomenal. It's stuff for the ages. So Dracula's stature is absolutely assured. But if you ask me, Curse of Frankenstein is arguably the stronger film. Cushing absolutely is phenomenal as the Baron here. Really chillingly cold, scientific genius, if you want to put it that way. And there's this rather annoying second character you can see here, who is trying to thwart his plans, or he has moral qualms, and the tension really comes between their differing values, and it's another phenomenal performance from Christopher Lee as the monster. He is, as Proper Horror Show said, there's so much pathos, and he's quite a pathetic creature, and Lee, with very limited, can only see so much of his face, but just with his body language and just with his eyes, really brings across the tragedy of this creature. It actually reminds me a little bit of the very end of The Fly, much later film, the David Cronenberg one, where there's that horrible monstrosity, and it's just kind of why do I exist type thing, and there's an element of that in Lee's monster, and it's obvious that the real monster is the Baron, is Victor Frankenstein, as played by Peter Cushing. And, he'd go on to play this role another 5 times, but all of the essential features of the character are here. There's a very interesting scene where he, he's having it off with the maid, and then, she tries to blackmail him. She tries to basically say, well, you need to marry me, you need to get care of me. And then, he just has the monster killer, basically. There's also a phenomenon. The script from Jimmy Sangster, somewhat legendary, but there's a very funny moment in the film where he's just had the monster kill this woman, and then we get a clip to him at breakfast, past the marmalade. So there's some wit, I would say, and arguably the Frankenstein films have more of that wit and more of that gallows humour, as Proper Horror Show said about them. than Dracula, which is a bit more straight. It's a bit more straight up, I would say. And of course, the Baron is a human being, and you get to spend a lot of time with him. He's got a lot of dialogue. Dracula as a character doesn't talk a lot, doesn't always have a lot of screen time. He's often really in the background of those films. And often, you know, the Hammer young lovers are, you know, almost like cardboard cutout. They're not the easiest characters. There's not a lot of depth to them, you know. Apart from some notable exceptions. I mean, I would argue Frankenstein created woman. You kind of get to know the young lovers a bit more there. But you know, in some of those Dracula movies, you're kind of just like waiting for them to be killed, you know. Anyway, Curse of Frankenstein, absolute classic. Now, my favourite of the Dracula movies was the fifth of them that was made, Taste the Blood of Dracula. It was Peter Sasdy was the director. This came out in 1970, and you know, towards the end of the Hammer hot streak. Really interesting though, from a thematic point of view. For a start, Anthony Hines, who was the screenwriter here, basically was told to write a Dracula film without Dracula in it. So they brought in Ralph Bates to play this Lord Courtly character. But then the American studios were like, what? There's no Christopher Lee? Get Christopher Lee. I don't care if he says no. Get him in. It doesn't matter how much it costs. So Lee got a massive payday, and he was inserted back into the film. And Anthony Hines had to quickly rewrite him. So I guess in the original version, this Lord Courtly character drinks the blood of Dracula, then becomes a vampire himself. In the rewrite, the hasty rewrite, he drinks the blood, and you know, he is killed, and then Dracula rises again out of his corpse type thing. So you can see where Lee comes in. That means that he's not in the film that much. Where this is really interesting is how it develops those earlier themes I was talking about the liberation of women and the liberalization of society in general, and how basically it ends up destroying the very fabric of the society. These three characters you can see in the screen grab are kind of, you know, Victorian gentlemen who, you know, see themselves as morally upstanding, and they go to church and all of that. And every third Sunday, I think every third Sunday of every month, they go down to the East London to nominally to help out in the soup kitchens and the charity kitchens, okay? But really they're not going for charity, they're going for libertine kicks and frolics. They're going to visit whores, they're going to visit the seedy underworld for their own kicks. And anyway, this Lord Courtly chap turns up, and they're starting to get a bit bored, the three libertines, with you know, the standard kind of whorehouse stuff. They're starting to get bored. The one on the left here, who plays the father of Alice, the main character, truly is quite the heel. He's a magnificent heel in this film. They're all pretty villainous, these three guys. But anyway, this Lord Courtly basically promises them, you know, sin beyond their dreams. And another thing I love about this film is Roy Kinnear, isn't it? You know, Mr. Salt from Willy Wonka. And he kind of gives the film, I don't know, I feel like I saw this one on TV quite a bit as well. So it's the presence of Roy Kinnear kind of stirs up some nostalgic feelings too. But basically what happens is that, you know, when Dracula comes, their daughters, so two of them have daughters, and I think the daughter of one is marrying the son of the other. And earlier on in the film, this chap on the left has been very strict on his daughter Alice, and he forbids her to see her young lover, and he's, you know, talking about being morally upstanding. Of course, he's a massive hypocrite, And, you know, they basically sell their soul to the devil here. And interestingly, when Dracula rises, he seduces the daughters of these men and then turns the young women against their fathers, and, you know, now as vampires, or now as under the influence of Count Dracula, they basically kill their fathers, you know, and Christopher Lee is like, the first, the second. So this is a kind of an interesting metaphor. You can see where I'm going with this. It's an interesting metaphor for basically, first of all, these men get corrupted, but then the corrupting influence takes over them, takes over the younger generation, their sons and daughters, especially their daughters, and the daughters end up killing basically the patriarchy in the film. Really interesting, I think, in all sorts of ways. I'm sure a feminist could have a field day with it. But also, on the flip side, from the, I guess you could say, the reactionary perspective, these films are basically saying, like, look, you lose yourself. If you lose your own personal morals, basically the morals of the whole society go, because the young women, without the oversight and protection of genuine patriarchs who are morally upstanding, these men were not morally upstanding, basically quickly and easily get corrupted by evil as represented by Count Dracula in this film. Really interesting movie. And for me, the best of the Draculas. It's got this kind of, the early 70s Hammer's got this glossy sheen to it. It's almost like a kind of magazine gloss. I can't, silvers, and it's got almost shimmery quality. So I don't like the visual look of it as much as the early Hammer, but there's something about Taste the Blood of Dracula that interests me on a sociological level and on a moral level as well. Number 2 is The Devil Rides Out. Terence Fisher, of course, absolute classic. And what I love, I've always loved films that have a clash between, an epic struggle between two titanic figures. Sleuth with Olivier and Michael Caine is one of my favourite films. I love Duel of Wits films. And this has got Christopher Lee again as a hero in this film, and Charles Gray, you may know him from the Bond movies, as a magnificent kind of sinister gentleman villain here, as the kind of leader of the occult, and it's just phenomenal, this film. The special effects, as Proper Horror Show mentioned, a little bit ropey in places, but honestly, I think the spider that you see was a real spider. It was actually a real spider. I saw a kind of making of thing where the special effects people were saying they actually killed 3 real spiders. One died under the lights. One died from acid. So they were real spiders that they used. It's just that, some of the kind of superimposition looks a bit fake and things towards the end there. But you kind of forgive all of that because it's such a good film. And really classic Hammer. A little bit unusual for them because they were adapting this Dennis Wheatley novel. Fisher is the director, but some of the usual team is missing for this one as well. The special effects, for example, was usually by Les Bowie. In this case, it was by a different crew because the head of that special effects company had actually bought the right for The Devil Rides Out, which is why the effects are a bit different on this one. But still, absolutely phenomenal. And if you were to say, what's the one Hammer film to show someone who's never seen one, maybe Devil Rides Out would be a good pick. Even though in many ways it's not typical it's not gothic in the same way. It's set in the 1920s, I think. So there's cars in it, vintage cars in it. Lee is a hero rather than a villain. There's no Cushing, but still it stands out in the general back catalogue. One of Terence Fisher's best movies. Fisher's dominated my list a bit more. I think Proper Horror Show did a good job of showing some of the other sides of Hammer. So when I saw Proper Horror Show's list, I was like, right, I'll make mine a bit more classique, as it were. And that just leaves my number 1 pick, which is Frankenstein Must Be Destroyed. I first of all, I love the titles. Dracula has risen from the grave. Frankenstein must be destroyed. I love that. But despite the sensational title, Frankenstein Must Be Destroyed is, in my opinion, the best of the Frankenstein films, just because the Baron is such a bastard in this one. He is such an absolute cunt in this film. By this point, whatever humanity that was still alive and well in him in Frankenstein Created Woman has been killed. At this point, he's just had enough. He sees everybody else beneath him. They don't recognize his genius. And how can I put this? In a weird way, as someone who's an academic myself and someone who rates my own intelligence and so on, there are some moments where you think, I found myself like kind of siding with him, thinking, oh my gosh, is this the demon within? Is this like the worst of me is in the Baron type thing? But it's also this critique in a way, or this exploration of the British utilitarian empiricist mindset and the worship of progressive science. Frankenstein sees himself as a progressive in these films, and he sees his enemies as reactionaries standing in the way of his genius. For me, Frankenstein Must Be Destroyed just takes it up a notch. Yes, there's the famous rape scene. Film doesn't really need it, but I think it can be justified, really, because by this point, the Baron just sees other people as tools, as pure utility for his own needs. And his treatment of this girl, who throughout the film he just makes her, I need you here to make coffee, basically. He wrecks her business, takes over her house, ruins her life, blackmails her boyfriend because he's been dealing in heroin, believe it or not. He is really evil in this film. But I think the rape scene is justified because, despite the qualms of everybody, I think it's thematically justified. The other really great thing about Frankenstein Must Be Destroyed is the monster, which in this case is somebody who can talk, somebody who has his wits about him and is a fellow genius. Actually, Frankenstein in this film finally creates the genius monster that he's been trying to create from the first movie, and he succeeds. Trouble is, of course, the monster's out for revenge because Frankenstein did not get his blessing to use his brain and his body. And the performance from Freddie Jones as the monster or as the creature is really good in this film, and brings a level of emotional investment and, again, pathos that is fairly rare in the Hammer oeuvre. I actually shed a tear during the scene in which he has to reveal himself to his wife, who's can't believe it. She's crying on the bed, and he's hiding behind the screen, and it's so tragic and it's so heart-wrenching. I actually shed a tear during that scene. So the combination of that particular creature and Cushing as this truly chilling evil presence, for me, makes this not only the best Frankenstein film in the Hammer oeuvre, but probably the best Hammer film overall. Let me know your picks for the top 10, your Hammer top 10 in the comments. Let me know what you make of Proper Horror Show's picks, what you make of my picks. Do you agree? Do you disagree? And we'll see you next time. If you liked this video, be sure to like and subscribe. You can join the channel for thousands of hours of past shows in the archive and hundreds of videos. If you have any questions, you can leave a super chat or a super thanks, and I'll be sure to pick it up during my weekly office hours, which run every Tuesday afternoon. I also provide courses at the academic agency, which I encourage people to buy. Thousands of students now have taken the Trivium to improve their skills in writing, logic and rhetoric. Just 3 of many courses available. Buy it now. But most importantly of all, friends, get out.